Good morning. Welcome to the One Armed Audiophile. That is some good stuff right there. Glad you could join us this morning or wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in or whenever you're watching this. My name is Ryan, and I have been wanting to do this series for a very long time to talk about digital front ends in digital audio for your hi-fi within the audiophile space. And since this is chapter 1, you probably have not seen me before. I want to give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm in my mid-40s. I consider myself a technologist and a gadget geek. I want you to know that the reason I called this the one-armed audiophile is I lost my left arm, or the use of my left arm, in a motorcycle accident many, many years ago, and that is a great story if we ever meet one-on-one, so let's do that. I'm also married, and I have a phenomenal wife who supports me in all of my audiophile adventures, including giving me a nice big media room to do all my experimentation and enjoyment of music and listening. I also participate on ABX Audiophiles. If you want to talk with me directly, I will be on that server pretty regularly, the ABX Audiophiles Discord server, and so you can find me there as IP everywhere. Now, why do I have any reason to talk about digital audio or network audio or packet audio? My professional background, I've got 30 plus years in networks. And I started building internet service providers really early on, and that quickly evolved to doing voice over frame relay and then voice over ATM and eventually voice over internet protocol, VoIP, if you will. And those are speech codecs. And that is the movement of communication, speech, to people talking over packet, and doing that for a very long time. And how that's related to audio is interesting because it's not as related as some people would have you believe, although we can learn a lot about how to move packets across a network that contain audio and make sure they arrive on time. And you've got a playout buffer within audio similar to a jitter buffer in speech. And that word, that buzzword, jitter, they talk about that a lot. And the other things they talk about that I see a lot are propagation delay and latency and overhead. And jitter's the big one that I see quite a bit. And we're going to dive into why jitter in speech and network jitter is really not a thing in audio. And if we want to, as part of this, maybe we'll do a whole chapter where I can bring up some packet captures and dive into that as well if we want to go that deep. But that's not really the topic for today, or really part of what I want to get to in the next chapter, and so we can start building. So what are we building? All right, this is the fun part. We're going to build a whole digital front end. Everything before the DAC is the goal here, and dive really deep into why we're picking the components we pick, what the components do, what they're responsible for, what's important, how they affect what we ultimately hear in our room at our listening position. And when we build anything, one of the first questions I often get is, well, what's our budget, right? And for this build, we're going to focus on a budget that is kind of moderate. We're not trying to make the cheapest digital front end that we can. We're trying to find something that's extremely high value. Now, there are uber expensive digital front ends that some people have put together or will try to sell you. And I want to try and stay away from those, although I hope that this series gives you an idea of some of the things that those really uber expensive front ends are trying to solve that are not really problems in digital audio before the DAC, right? And so that's part of what we're going to do with this. So we'll be kind of moderate budget, and we'll show costs and how much the thing is that we're building all along the way. And is this a DIY project? Not entirely. There's a little bit of DIY. And there's ways around that so we can make it zero DIY, and we can talk about that. What you'll see on this channel and through these chapters, however, is a little bit of DIY. And the reason for that is I learn best when I take things apart. I was just one of those kids that just took things apart, right? And that's sort of the natural engineer in me. And I think those in the audiophile space always have a little bit of that engineer in them. And so even if you don't participate in some of the DIY stuff, or you don't participate in the builds itself, and I think there's still something to get out of that watching somebody go through it. So we're still going to do that. Now, what is a digital front end? What is it responsible for? Of course, that's streaming, right? So you got your Tidal, Qobuz, Amazon Music, Spotify, SoundCloud, right? All of these streaming providers are part of the digital front end. You've also got files, right? And you have files from ripping CDs, you have files you've downloaded, you've purchased, those sorts of things. And also internet radio, podcasts. Any really a source where you can either load it onto your digital front end or you can pull it across the internet. We'll dive into some of those services and why some will give you better sound quality than others, but we want to make it as compatible as possible. And so we'll look at various software and their compatibilities. Again, we're going to be really working towards building everything up to the DAC. There are plenty of DAC reviews online. There's no reason to continue to dive into how a DAC works, or what is a DAC, or what's the best DAC. There are plenty of websites, plenty of videos about DACs. I'm really focused on everything before the DAC and why it matters. And both why it matters, but more importantly, why it doesn't matter. Let's dispel some of these myths and maybe we'll cause a little drama. That's always a fun thing to do these days on the internet, cause a little drama. Sure, we'll do that. Now, I think it's best if we look at the parts and pieces that we're going to build through these chapters. So let's hop over to what I call TinyPad, the whiteboard, if you will. I've got my iPad here to help us out. And the first thing we're going to talk about is, if I get my pencil up here, the first thing that we're going to talk about is this box right here, okay? And obviously, when we talk about putting together a digital front end, this is going to be some kind of PC or some kind of a Mac, or maybe you're thinking a small board computer. Some kind of compute is going to be part of our digital front end. And we're going to call this the source. Right? So throughout these chapters, we will work towards calling it the source. Then we're going to talk about something you may recognize. Your phone, your tablet, maybe you have a PC or a laptop or a MacBook that you like to use. We're going to call these the control. And the control is going to be our human interaction with our source. So the source is going to be responsible for our heavy lifting of the hard work that our digital front end needs to do in order to provide us a good experience. And that good experience, that interaction, what we touch and feel and build an emotional attachment to beyond the music, comes through the control, right? So we're up here interacting with the control. And quite honestly, if that's a bad experience, it's going to sound bad. It just is. If you're in a bad mood, the music's going to sound bad. So we want a really enriching environment that the control brings to us and makes us happy, puts a smile on our face, and then the music's just going to sound better. So the source has to be stable. It has to have a lot of compute power and robustness and overhead so we don't bog it down. It's responsible for managing our streaming. It's responsible for managing the library that we have for all of those files that we have. And if you don't have digital files, pause right here, go purchase some music, support an artist, start collecting some digital downloads. That's a really important part of the industry. We've got to support our artists. And one way to do that, start buying digital music and putting it on your source. So once we've got our source and we've got our control, and our control, you probably already have something today. So when we go back to budget, we'll be using phones or tablets or whatever we have today. But we do need to make sure that whatever software we put on the source has compatible software with our control, right? So whether that's an application out of the Play Store or application out of the Apple Store, we'll make sure that that occurs as well. And that's just as important. All right, so next up, we've got a box on this side, commonly called the streamer, but I'm going to call it a digital transport. All right, our digital transport. I'm going to hop back and tell you a little story on why I call this a digital transport. Early on, most people's experience with digital music was the CD. All right, CDs have been around for a long time. We had the heyday of the CD era where people were buying tons of CDs. The music industry had never made more money than the CD era because we were constantly buying music. And those little discs were digital. They were PCM 1644-1. They called it the Red Book format. And that data on that disc, we used a CD player. And that CD player, over time, as we're listening to these things, we were recognizing that, hey, maybe this format has some flaws. Or maybe just the way that we built CD players have some flaws. And one of the things that we learned during that era is the separation of the mechanicals, the spinny bits, right? The part that spins the CD and the motor that moves the laser, that the power supplies and the mechanics of that were very noisy. And they were inflicting a poor performance of the actual digital to audio conversion. And so what happened was this idea came about that let's separate the two. Let's separate the mechanicals from the sensitive electronics, from the digital audio converter, the DAC. And now we can have a DAC that's in its own chassis with its own power supply. And we can have a set of mechanical things, the spinny bits, in its own chassis with its own power supply and vibration control, and everything that we do there can be specialized to that, and everything that we need to do to keep the sensitive electronics and make sure that that digital to analog conversion is as accurate as possible. Now we can really focus on that. And the only thing that that transport had to do was feed a clean set of bits, as clean as possible, right? So it did all the error correction off the CDs. Those of you of a certain age probably scratched a few CDs. So CD players or CD transports, they did error correction. And their job was read the bits, send a bit stream out the back that is absolutely as clean as possible. So where do we need the cleanest bit stream possible? Well, we need it to come off our digital transport, because sitting here, right, this is our DAC, right? So our digital transport is responsible for feeding the cleanest bits possible to our DAC, right? So that's why I call it a digital transport. Now, maybe we could call it a DDC, right? Digital to digital converter, because we're taking network to another digital output, but I like to call it digital transport. So that's what we're going to do. So we've got our source running our software, doing all the heavy lifting. We're interacting with it in our control platform, and we're having a great time, and we love interacting with it, and it's making us smile, and it's doing everything we expect it to do, and it's stable, and all of those bits need to end up at the digital transport to feed a very clean signal, very quiet signal over to our DAC so we can actually decode this digital bit stream, get an analog signal out the back. So all these things have to talk. So of course, in order for them to talk with each other, we need to build a network. All right. So we have our network now. And we're going to do a chapter on the network and the important pieces of the network and where we are needing stability in our network and where it's not so important for stability. And one of those areas is right here where, because this is doing the heavy lifting, it's also the heavy network piece. And the reason it's the heavy network piece is because up in this area, you've got some internet, right? And if you're streaming, you got bits flowing into your source. It's taking those, doing things with those, and kicking them back out on your network. And so this interface here at your source oftentimes is doing double the work of any other network interface. And when I say double the work, right, audio is not a lot of bandwidth, okay? It's not a bandwidth problem. It's a packet per second problem. All right, so if we double the number of packets per second that we are trying to move across an interface, we need to make sure that that interface can be very chatty and it's not going to cause problems with our network gear. And it's another reason why this connection right here, really important to be hardwired. Now your control, right, is probably on Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi doesn't deal with large amounts from a packet per second perspective, doesn't deal with it very gracefully. To be very careful, and that requires a lot of tuning in wireless. So as we dive into this, we're going to say, okay, here's a problem, right? Wireless isn't great for tons and tons of packets, for things that want to be super chatty. So we can do two things. We can tune the wireless network and we can do everything we can and pull our hair out trying to make it work. Or we can just hardwire the thing that is moving a lot of packets, right? So just as an example, and we'll talk about some ways, even if you think you don't have the ability to hardwire the source, we'll talk about some different network technologies that we can use in order to do that. And yeah, that's going to be our build over these chapters. And that's just a quick glimpse as to some of the things we'll talk about and some of the deep dives that we will do. One thing I didn't talk about, all this stuff has to be plugged into the wall, doesn't it? So we're going to talk about power as well. Oh, there's a lot. Be a couple chapters. We'll have a good series. I'm looking forward to it. But at every step of the way, ultimately, what we really need to do, we also need to test, all right? And so we'll be talking about testing. If we're going to build a source, we want to make sure that that thing is stable before we move on. If we build a digital transport, we want to make sure that that's stable and that's hitting our performance bar before we move on. The last thing we want, and I hear this story pretty regularly, put a new something in my system, it sounded terrible. I don't know why. It reviewed great. Everybody told me it would work great. We start troubleshooting. Guess what? Something else in the network is causing an issue. So it wasn't the thing that you put in, and now you've got a bad perception of that thing because something else in your digital front end had become unstable. So testing. We'll talk about how to test this stuff and make sure that it's stable and not causing a fault in your digital front end. Because a fault in your digital front end will change your perception of everything else downstream. And that's unreliable. That's not good. That's not good for great listening. All right, So upcoming chapters, we talked a little bit about it when we were going through the diagram on TinyPad, but obviously we're going to order a machine. We're going to order a source. We're going to load an OS on it. We're going to find some software that we can use to manage our library and those files and all of our digital downloads and our great purchases from all these great artists. Support your artists. And then we'll go into the digital transport and kind of what we can use for that and what our digital transport selection is going to be. Load some software on that. Then we'll talk about network. How do we cable these things together? What is super important to pay attention to? What's not so important? And some of the things you can do in your own network to make sure that, again, we're stable, we're tested, things are working at the level that we need them to work so we don't have to worry about them. And then we're going to get into some things that may, again, cause some drama, some controversy. Oversampling, upsampling, and bitstream conversion. Well, what do I, bitstream? So yeah, let's talk about PCM versus DSD, or PCM versus 1-bit, or multi-bit versus 1-bit. All right, let's get into it, because ultimately your digital front end, if you want the highest level of sound quality and fidelity, we have to get a bit stream into your DAC so that DAC runs at its most optimum level. I will tell you, there's different bit streams we can send into the DAC, and it'll change the quality of the sound that comes out the back end. So that's going to be a whole chapter diving into that. And yes, we'll talk a lot about DSD and 1-bit and why that may be very important to your setup. All right. I love me some DSD. Anyways, a little bit about me again. The drama of it all. Wow. Okay. And one of the other things we're going to talk about are problems in digital audio. Digital audio has problems. It always has. But those problems have evolved over time. And the problems that we had a couple years ago, we've eliminated in a lot of ways, but eliminating those have introduced other problems. So when you have a problem in digital audio, you find a workaround or a way to limit the impact of that problem on your sound quality. And as the technology advances and our interfaces between our digital transport and our DAC change over time, and the quality of those interfaces or the components that make up those interfaces change, sometimes the problem, the workaround we had a couple years ago, that workaround is not as good as just eliminating that problem and looking at a new way of doing things. But that new way of doing things may introduce a new issue or a new problem. But the workaround for that limits significantly how that new problem impacts sound quality. So of course we want to introduce that problem into our digital front end, because we've got better workarounds for that problem, and we'll eliminate the one that we never had a great workaround for. And we'll talk about all of that as part of this build, and what problems are in our digital transport that we're building, and how we're minimizing those to get the best sound quality out of our system. And then we'll go into a chapter about how to listen. It's really important to understand what to listen for in digital audio, to understand what your DAC is doing and where its limitations are, because digital audio isn't perfect, because digital audio has issues, and we can play with these trade-offs. Where you sit in your listening position, one trade-off may be completely acceptable in that listening position, where another one just causes you to get up and leave the room. And why is that happening? We'll talk about that. And so that's sort of a lesson on listening to digital audio, and some final testing after we build this out. All right, so let's wrap this thing up. In this chapter of intro, right? And is there an easier way? I got this question. Yeah, there is a lot easier. way than what we're putting together here. And they're called all-in-ones or integrated digital front ends and single box, right? There's lots of companies that want to sell you a single box, but I hope that through this series of chapters on digital front ends, you'll start to understand what's in those boxes, because these components that we're building, that we're talking about, all still relevant, right? You still need compute. You still need to throw bits out the back, or some of the all-in-ones have DACs in them, and how that works within the chassis itself. And it'll give you a much better idea of how those things are constructed and where they potentially are cutting corners to cut costs. And in some ways, how those all-in-ones are saying that they're solving problems, when in actuality, again, we've made that trade-off already. And so if you've got an all-in-one that has solved something that really isn't a problem anymore, is that the best sound quality you can get out of it? And so it's fun to play with parts and pieces and ability to swap in and swap out. But yes, there's an easier way, and plenty of companies will sell you a box that does all of this. Just drop it in your system, you're good to go. And just like I love taking things apart, right, to understand them, that's what this series is going to do. So even if you're not building, like I said, I hope that you enjoy the deconstruction of our digital front end and how we're building it, and you get something out of it. And to me, it's like integrated amplifiers, right? If you want to do a deep dive evaluation on an integrated amplifier, you still need to understand how amplifiers work, how front ends work, how output stages work, because all of that still lives in that. And if you have a deeper understanding, you can understand the areas of an integrated amplifier that are more meaningful to you, really. And so we want to do that with our digital front end, I think. All right. And maybe this whole series isn't for you. That's great. At the end of the day, it's all about the music and making sure you can enjoy the music. But I hope you get something out of it. And if you have questions and you think I should be covering something about digital front ends that I didn't mention, please comment or come find me on the ABX Discord server, and we'll talk about it, and I can incorporate it into a future chapter. All right, so up next, we're going to be ordering our source, and we're going to be putting it together, and we're going to be loading an OS on it and talking about operating systems and the ability to tinker and what software we might load on it from a source, from a media management perspective. And that'll all be up in the next chapter. So I hope to see you there. Please subscribe. That would be great. This is a new channel, trying to get some people invested in it a little bit. And I look forward to it. We're going to have a lot of fun. Until then.